Metropolis Healthcare, which is a chain of pathology labs having presence not only in India, but South Asia and Africa. Now, what is interesting is that Ms. Shah is someone who has received a degree in finance from the University of Texas and is the alumnus of Harvard Business School. So apart from her role at Metropolis Healthcare, she is also a financial investor and a passionate business mentor who is also passionate about women leadership and empowerment. So welcome to Business World and BW Healthcare, ma'am, for this conversation. Thank you so much for taking our time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So my first question to you, Ms. Shah, is that there have been a lot of talks around the gap between healthcare infrastructure that India needs and what we see on the ground. And there has been discussion about the number of doctors that we need and the gap that exists, the ratio between doctors and the patients and hospital beds. Now, all these gaps actually came to light during the second lockdown when the healthcare infrastructure just seemed to collapse under the pressured circumstances. We did see that last year, government did put a focus on healthcare, making it the primary pillar of the union budget. What, in your opinion, is it? Was it enough? And how do you see the union budget 2022 build up on it?
So, I think we have to first separate two things. I think as Indians and people in healthcare, we've always known that there is a big gap in our healthcare infrastructure across the country. Frankly, for any government to be able to manage this, for almost 1.5 billion people on their own is very difficult. And therefore, the private industry has always recommended that these things have to be done through public-private partnerships, where we can collaborate and bring the skill and talent and expertise of the private sector and innovation and technology and work with the government's resources as well to be able to provide healthcare to all Indians. Unfortunately, this has been something which has been missing now for 50 years post our independence, 60 years post our independence, and I really hope that the governments will put a lot of attention into giving healthcare the kind of priority we need. We keep talking about the economy every budget, we keep talking about economic development, and that's very critical. But the social fabric of our nation, taking care of our people, is as important, and I really cannot emphasize that enough. I think most people look at the wave that happened and the shortages that happened and then connect that to the healthcare gap. And I don't necessarily see it the same way. If you look at any country, including America, which is considered to have some of the best healthcare infrastructure, they too, during the lockdown and the waves, had a deep shortage of oxygen, of beds, of doctors, because that is the nature of a pandemic. And that is the nature of the peak of the wave of a pandemic. However ready you are, the peak of a wave is probably going to be higher than your readiness and your capacity. So I don't think that was something necessarily that could have been planned for and managed years in advance. Could we have done something in the short run? Yes. Knowing that a wave was coming, could we have built our oxygen capacity better? Could we have built better beds? Could we have done those things? Yes. But if you're talking about permanent healthcare infrastructure, could we have done this 10 years ago in anticipation? No. So I don't see the two connection. But going forward, I definitely do believe and I hope that if we can use the PPP model in a very smart way. So far, I find the Indian government is very focused on accessibility of healthcare. And while that's important, accessibility is not the only requirement, because imagine you have very accessible healthcare, but which is very poor. You're going to land up doing more damage than good. You're spreading a poison rather than spreading a good thing. And unfortunately, in India, our healthcare infrastructure has had no governance. So health is a state subject. At the state level, there is no enforcement of whether hospitals, labs follow the right processes or not. So in our industries, it is a well-known fact that you can either become affordable in one of three ways, right? You can either do it because of economies of scale, you build large volume and you're able to reduce the cost, or you're able to do it through innovation, or you're able to do it through jugaad. And in India, unfortunately, in healthcare, it's done through jugaad. in a large amount of the sector of companies who are not following the kind of governance that we are following of world standards. Now, this is a problem. And if you try to make this jugaad more accessible all across the country, you're going to have a deep disaster. So I urge the government to not only focus on accessibility, but minimum standards and governance of the infrastructure, because that is very, very critical.
That's a beautiful point that you brought out, creating minimum standards, and which is a responsibility of the government. Now, the other sector, when we look at the shortage of doctors and healthcare professionals that we are all aware of, now, is there a need to reform the medical education and training sector to bridge this gap that exists? And there has been always a discussion. What comes to my mind is the balance between the quantity, which is the number of doctors that we need, versus the quality of doctors that we can produce. Do you think a public, private partnership can work there as well? Should the private sector be invited to participate in the medical education? And if yes, what is it that you think that the government needs to do?
Absolutely. Look, there are private sector colleges, as we know. But I think the regulation around some of this needs to change. Like we often talk about our tax structure in India, and the government has done a good job in really reducing the corporate tax and making it more compatible to global standards. But overall, our tax structure probably still needs some work, right? It requires more innovation. The same way, I think our medical education requires a deep thinking around what we can do differently. Today, the number of colleges we have are abysmal. The seats that are in those colleges are very low. The kind of corruption that happens on the ground in those medical education colleges is also a problem. Often students have to pay for seats. And then we expect that, okay, once they come out with these huge burdens on their head of paying donation for a seat, and then they start doing bad practices in their practice because they want to recover that money. So we are actually at the medical education stage itself, we are setting the wrong momentum and the wrong benchmarks and the wrong practices, which then follow them for the next 30, 40 years of their career. We definitely need to expand the number of seats. I think we need to do that by bringing private investment in. And again, it goes back to governance. Look, private sector is not all bad or all good. By just inviting private sector and asking them to do the job doesn't mean it's always going to be done well. There are bad apples in every part, right, in private and public. So the most important thing the government should be focusing on is, rather than provision, they should be focusing on governance. Lay the policy and then monitor and do governance. Leave the legs and hands and the day-to-day jobs and the operations to the private sector by giving them volumes and telling them that, look, I'm giving you, this 10 million lives in this city, or these number of students. So that way private guys can come in knowing the volumes and invest accordingly. Often PPPs in our country have got very bad reputations because the way the PPPs are done is that the government makes no commitments and private has to estimate on their own as to how things are going to work. And then again, you're attracting the companies who are interested in doing jugaad rather than doing good professional work, because a company who's interested in doing good professional work needs volumes. They need contracts which are fair. So again, you're going to attract poor quality firms to come in and do work, which is not the point. So I think, if we just, these are very simple things. I'm not saying anything which is, nuclear science, but I think if we implement some of these simple things, I think we can take healthcare a very far way.
Right. I think the challenge is on the execution front. Yeah. I want to also get your views on something which is the need of the hour. We've seen that there's a lot of technological development that is happening in the space of health and wellness. It is definitely helping build efficiencies. It is organizing the caregivers as well as the seekers. Now, how can the government policymakers give the push that it requires to accelerate this growth in the health tech space? Now, what can be done to invite startups? Since you come from a background which is a finance background, you also are an investor, you are keen, passionate about the women entrepreneurship. What is it that the government needs to do to invite more startups in this sector that can come in and create the impact that India deserves, Indian healthcare deserves?
See, healthcare is one of those sectors which is currently very non-digital, very brick and mortar. The gatekeepers are the doctors, at least in services sector. And frankly, I have personally seen many startups that I've mentored in the healthcare space come in, last 1 or 2 years and die. And the reason for this is because the most important ingredient in healthcare to succeed is credibility and trust. And often what the startups lack is credibility and trust because they're a startup. You can't have it from day one. But what you need as a startup is the ability to work with patients, with doctors, to show your product, to experiment with your product, to learn from it, to improve your product, which often they never get the chance to do because nobody is willing to give them the first try. So really what we need to do is we need to bring a collaboration between startups and existing private companies and allow those startups to actually be experimental in these companies and actually see on the patient basis. Let's say Metropolis already has patient base. Can I use a startup's technology on my patient base and see how it works? I can. But why would I? I would only do it because I think, okay, it's going to be great. But frankly, the time it takes to experiment, I might say, forget it, I don't want to do it. If the government creates some sort of policy or some sort of encouragement that encourages private industries to do this, then I feel startups would get a better way to actually know whether their products succeed and actually have a platform for success.
When it comes to pathology labs, what kind of announcements do you think will bring growth to the diagnostics business? In terms of, because this is one sector which is dependent on a lot of equipment, supply chain management, professionals, technicians being hired. So what will give that push to the diagnostics business?
Yeah, I think the two things, right? Number one, even today, we are doing 4,000 varieties of tests in India as Metropolis, right? Most of these are specialized tests. So everything that's possible in the world, we do in India and we provide it to Indian citizens because we want to make it possible in our own country. But if you actually look at the bottom 3,000 tests, they're actually so specialized that the volumes for those are very low. And therefore, they tend to be expensive and therefore they tend to be not used as much. So it becomes like a vicious cycle. So I think the first thing is, how do we make health insurance more prolific and prevalent in India so that all people are covered, number one. And health insurance also covers diagnostics because today it doesn't. So the first thing is, what can we do in the budget? Can we drive some policy that encourages everybody to take health insurance and cover themselves, number one, and then ensure that the health insurance covers all the different pieces of healthcare, right? That's the first piece. The second piece is, if the government's objective is to make healthcare more affordable, then first thing is we have to see what are the input costs and what are the ingredients. Now, there are two things which are very clearly up to the government. Number one, I would say 60-70% of the materials that we use are imported. And government charges customs duties, all kinds of duties, GSTs on all of these different ingredients that are coming in. At the same time, healthcare is not allowed to charge GST to consumers. So all of that has to be absorbed by healthcare companies, and finally it will be passed on to the consumer in cost. So the simple thing a government can do is to, if possible, remove or reduce those customs duties and allow for GST to be charged, even if it is only 2%, 5%, whatever the lower bracket is, to the patients. That will allow healthcare companies to move to an even more affordable place. That's number one. That's the second piece. I think that the third piece goes back to what I said, which may not necessarily be so budgetary driven, but about in making those investments in states. So can they encourage states? Like there is a central health fund and there is a state health fund. Can the central health ministry create a carrot and stick program for the states to ensure enforcement of minimum standards locally? The minute that happens, you will find that all the small players that are there, which are operating not under good standards, will die out. And automatically, the quality of healthcare will get better. And automatically, the larger players or the mid-sized players will be able to invest more in building capacity, which will increase volumes and reduce costs. So it's all tied in there, I think, about making sure we move to an affordable, accessible, and quality-driven healthcare system. Got it.
Now, other than the budget, what do you think the government needs to do? Because specifically for diagnostics, and you talk about, that the bottom level, the diagnostics and health checks need to be more prevalent, be accessible and affordable. But what about preventive health checkups? How can we promote that so that, we there's a lot of burden on our healthcare system which can be reduced if there are preventive health checks which have been promoted?
See, I think the government came out with a tax deduction for preventive healthcare, and personally, I don't see the two linked. People don't not get, they don't go and do an annual checkup because they're going to get a tax deduction. They go do an annual checkup because they care for their health. And frankly, COVID has done more for wellness than the tax deduction ever did. So I think the key thing is to promote the behavioral change by getting people to be more conscious and careful about their health. And frankly, I don't think there is so much the government can do except in invest in education and talk about India as a healthier country. We talked about Clean India at one point. Can we do a whole campaign talking about a healthier India at one point? Can there be a linkage between your premiums and your health? Do you pay a higher premium if you're not so fit? And can you pay a lesser premium if you're fitter? What we need to do is create those linkages between all the different parts of healthcare that allow for data to be stored in one place, and then the monies that you're paying to health insurance and the outcomes of your health all linked together. This is what other countries in the world are moving towards. Not that anybody has gotten to a great place, but this is what countries are moving towards. And I think if India can do this, keeping in mind that we are digitally more forward than many countries, if we can skip over one whole layer like we did in the mobile telecommunications phase and move straight into a digital world, I think that's a great opportunity for our country.
In an earlier panel, I was speaking to someone and we were talking of these smart cards coming in. And one big change I think that India needs at this point in time is that while every organization in the healthcare ecosystem is working on healthcare records and healthcare information systems, they're all working in silos, basis what is working for them. But what do you think government needs to do to push every health information system of every a member in the ecosystem to speak to each other, interoperability, so that it benefits healthcare and the people of this country? It becomes useful for people.
See, it goes back to the same point I was saying. Today, if they go to, let's say they say, okay, let's digitize all pathology records. Yeah. Now, the first question will come up is how many path labs are there? Nobody knows, including the government, because there is no registration mechanism for even registering a path lab. The second question will come, okay, now suppose we know theoretically there are 150,000 labs. Do they have any information on these 150,000? No. Right? Is there any oversight on what they do? No. So therefore, the reality is out of these 150,000, almost 140,000 are so small that many of them don't even use computers and printers. Right? Where is this situation of integration of data, which is very complex? You need some complex APIs and people to manage. So first things first is we need to bring the level of healthcare to a certain level first. And it can actually be done in one swoop. If the government said, my job is to build a superhighway where I have all these healthcare providers connecting into, and each patient will have like an Aadhaar-like health ID, which is what they're planning, a health stack. And then everybody will upload data around that health ID to the superhighway. Mm-hmm. So a patient, when they log into the superhighway, gets all records, whether they come to Metropolis or they go to a hospital or they go to a pharmacy, right? Or they go to a doctor. Mm-hmm. Brilliant idea. But doing this at the same time, you need to clean up, right? The guys who are not able to connect into the system, right? Mm-hmm. So you give them time. You say, okay, let's give it 12 months, 24 months. But at the end of 24 months, all the people who have not logged into the system need to be cut out. Because if you don't cut them out, you're going to have such a long tail of healthcare centers, which you have no oversight of, no control on, that your entire project will never get the economies of scale you need. So we have to confront both these issues at the same time, which is cleaning up the quality of providers at the same time of digitizing records.
Fantastic. So my one last question to you, Ms. Shah. What is it that your institution is going to do in 2022, which is going to be different or will make a lot of difference to the Indian healthcare sector?
So, organizations like us, and I say that for actually all healthcare workers, have made a tremendous difference already in 2020 and 21 by taking care of all Indians in COVID. But specifically in 22, Metropolis has decided to take healthcare to the next level in terms of going to smaller towns. Urban India for a long time has now enjoyed, private urban India has enjoyed good quality healthcare, for people who are affording. I'm not, and the ones who are not affording still obviously go to the government, centers. But even affording Indians in smaller towns did not always have access to good quality healthcare, and we would like to bring them that. So we have actually identified another 100 cities in which we want to set up labs, and we're in the process of doing that. And these will be tier 2, tier 3 towns, where the 4,000 varieties of tests that a person, an affording Indian in Bombay or Delhi or Calcutta or Bengaluru enjoys should now be possible in an Akola and Muzaffarnagar and a small town in Tamil Nadu as well. So I think that's what 22 is going to be and beyond is going to be for us. Along with that, we're also spending a lot of money in an investment into technology building. And in line with what we discussed, how can we make healthcare convenient for consumers? How can we integrate data? How can we work with the government to work with their health ID so that patients can have access to all of this data from wherever they are? So I think technology and access are going to be the two main drivers.
One more question. You spoke about 2022 being the year where you'll make your presence in the tier 2, tier 3. Now, what is it that you expect from the government that can give you the push that will help you to accelerate the growth in the tier 2, tier 3?
Actually, we don't need too much from the government. Like I said, I think if government was only able to resolve the GST plus the taxation issue, it would allow us to make our services more affordable in these markets where we know that the affordability is lower than urban cities. And frankly, the only way we can do that is if our cost of ingredients go down. Otherwise, how do we do it? So either, a more long-term solution is to create policies that encourage the innovation of indigenous manufacturing of these chemicals and machines. But the reality is that's not a short-term plan. That's a 10-year plan. So in the short term, I think the government, the only thing they can do is to, like I said, invest in the implementation of governance and minimum standards and work on the policies for duties and GST. I think these two things can help us.
Got it. Thank you so much for your time, Ms. Shah. It has been a pleasure to have you on Business World and BW Healthcare. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Ms. Ameera. Thank you, Harvinderji, for having this insightful discussion. In fact, healthcare has been one of the most, one of the sectors which has been the focus area of the government over the last 2 years. Like we spoke in the last session, Harvinderji, a lot of things were exposed, administrative flaws. And we were also talking about smart health cards, which could likely be a possibility. So let's see what the budget has in store for the sector. Thank you, Harvinderji. I would now like to bring Mr. Vishal Thapar on board. Mr. Thapar, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Now I can see you as well.
Yes, sir.
Namaskar. How are you?
I'm good, sir. Thank you very much. So waiting for a panelist to join in.
Yes, all our panelists have joined. And before I, jump on and give you the panel, Vishalji, I would like to understand from you, do you expect anything specific from the defense budget? Mr. Thapar is the group editorial head of BW Defense. He has been a defense expert for quite some time. He has been a veteran in the space. So first, I would like to understand from you, Mr. Vishal, do you think there would be some focus on the defense this year? Like more spending per se?
Can you see all of us, and are all of us audible? Abhinav?
I can see you. I'll check for the remaining panelists as well.
So this will be the Modi government's 9th consecutive defense budget, and the allocation for defense is eagerly awaited because this is the highest allocation amongst all the central ministries. There is the total allocation for the year 21-22 was 4,78,000 crores, which is over $65 billion. This is something which represents almost 14% of the total central government budget spend, and it represents 2.15% of the GDP.
Correct.
This is this is also the largest allocation for amongst all the central ministries. The allocation is something which is for a vital sector. It involves India's security. And the other concern is how well spent this allocation is and whether it can be better spent. So we have an eminent panel which will discuss the issue. I don't see Admiral Menon with us yet, but let me try introduce the panel for you. We have, and where is General Saha? Is he here?
I don't see him.
So yeah, so
you can go ahead with the introduction.
Yes, I will introduce the eminent panelists who are already with us. I see Colonel K.B. Kuber. He is the Director of Aerospace and Defense Practice for Ernst & Young. He is has been very closely associated with the defense procurement edifice in India. Oh, we have General Saha here now, and he was also he was the founder director of the Defense Offsets Wing, and he is a mentor and a guide to many in India's defense industrial complex. Welcome, Colonel Kuber. We have with us Mr. Amit Kaushish. He is a leading commentator on military spending. He was financial advisor procurements to the Ministry of Defense and also associated formally with India's premier defense studies think tank, the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. We're also very honored to have with us Professor Lakshman Behera. He is an associate professor at the Special Center for National Security Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he was earlier a leading scholar at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, where he had an expertise for analyzing India's defense budget, amongst a host of other things. We are also very honored to have in our midst Admiral Raja Menon. He is a military strategist, a former Assistant Chief of Naval Staff, and the author of a nuclear strategy for India. We also have General Saha with us now. He was a former commander, corps commander in Kashmir, then the Deputy Chief of Army Staff, where he was closely associated with drafting the blueprint for capability building of the future. He also founded the Army Design Bureau, and post his retirement, he was associated with industry as the first Director General of the Society for Indian Defense Manufacturers of the Confederation of Indian Industry. He has also been a very eminent member of the National Security Advisory Board and has headed several crucial committees, including the one to privatize the ordnance factories. So I will give a brief introduction and then toss it over to the panelists for their introductory remarks, which will go on for 5 or 7 minutes. Post that, we will open the session for discussion amongst these eminent panelists. So as I was saying, we have the third largest defense spend in the world, over $65 billion. Last year's allocation was at 4.78 lakh crores, which makes it the highest allocation amongst all central ministries, accounts for almost 14% of the central government spend, and for the vital sector for ensuring India's security. So I'm going to hand this, first to Admiral Menon with a brief introduction to a paper he recently authored on the reorientation, calling for the reorientation of India's military grand strategy from a continental one to an offensive oceanic strategy to deal with the Chinese threat. The fundamentals of sticking to a continental defense are wrong, according to him, and we need to reorient from a continental approach to a maritime one, where India is perhaps better positioned to shape the battlefield and build punitive capacity. At the moment, he argued that the Indian Army is fighting geography, not the Chinese. So this is an interesting and a provocative thought, and why I bring this here in a discussion where we are talking about our expectations for the defense budget, analyzing the defense budget, and perhaps looking at whether it is well apportioned. So I'll hand this first to Admiral Menon for his opening remarks. Admiral Menon, sir.
Thank you, Vishal. As Vishal says, I have written this paper, Reorienting Military Grand Strategy, and I have written it in the classical American pattern, which is to say, it's written in two phases. The first phase is to choose a certain date in the future and define the geopolitical and geoeconomic scenario for that date. And having defined that, then write a strategy to attack that scenario. Now, as far as the scenario is concerned, it's not very difficult to define. As Arvind Subramaniam has said, the rise of China is the overwhelming factor. And it has overtaken the United States in net capital worth in the year 2020. It has not reached the same military power, but it has an aspiration to greatness, as exemplified in Xi Jinping's speech at the 19th Congress. So we are committed to an adversarial, competitive neighbor for the next half a century. And if we all accept that the national objective of India is the upliftment of the people and the growth of the GDP in a country where millions still go to bed hungry at night, we must realize that we have to defend this country within the constraints of a budget. And the leading factor in defining the grand strategy is that we must have a punitive capability against China. Otherwise, the hegemonic power of China in Asia and the world will constantly thwart our attempts to grow and restrict our geopolitical space. Now, we are doing a pretty good job defending our territory, but that is not enough, because we need to deter Beijing from doing the acts against India, like weaponizing Pakistan, constantly bothering us, salami slicing on the border, choosing bases in the Indian Ocean, surrounding us geopolitically. If we are to prevent all that, we need a punitive capability. And we must choose an area where the geography favors us. In the Himalayan border, the geography favors China. It favors it so much that they have built a 6-lane highway from the Arunachal Tri-Junction all the way to Xinjiang, with the result that they can move acclimatized troops laterally and overwhelm us at the point of contact. So although their army is 300,000 smaller than our army, at the point of contact, we are invariably overwhelmed by the Chinese army. And we must choose a better area to fight in, and that is the Indian Ocean. Because you look at the maritime geography of China, it's very bad. They are continental power. They face the Pacific Ocean. Their economic assets, 70% of their commodity trade and 65% of their oil goes through the Indian Ocean. The connectivity between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is through the geographically constrained Malacca Straits. So we have geography on our side in the Indian Ocean. So if we use the Navy and the Air Force wisely, we can create a stranglehold on the Malacca Straits so that the Chinese get the signal, Beijing gets the signal that to meddle with India means a threat to their lifeline. And this is the main thrust of my paper. And I believe that whatever we do, we'll have to remain within the 2.15% of the GDP budget that we've been given. If we don't have that limit, well, then the sky is the limit. But if we have a financial constraint, then it must be balanced by our security policy and our foreign policy. We have enough money to fight on one front. So there is a lot of irresponsible talk that we are facing two fronts. Yesterday, there was a very senior minister who said, "Ghar mein ghus ke marenge." Now, this is not the kind of foreign policy that we can manage with 2.15% of the GDP. That's all I have to say, Vishal, in the opening remarks.
So thank you very much for these opening remarks. But before I hand this over to General Saha, where you're obviously asking for an increase in the defense budget. That's what you're asking. You're not asking for a reorientation of or a reapportionment of the budget to give a greater share to the Navy, are you? And I would also sort of like to bring this to the notice of the panel that the increase in the Chinese PLA fleet, the PLA Navy fleet over the last 1 year, that the increase, it totals the entire size of India's Eastern Fleet. That is the kind of disparity which China is seeking to build up. So, sir, is it just I mean, you mentioned that it may be difficult to go beyond 2.1% of the GDP, although the best case scenario is an increase in this proportion. But are you calling for, given the current fiscal constraints, are you calling for a reapportionment of the defense budget, which for the Navy currently stands at about 16%?
Yes, indeed. Vishal, I'm sorry, is it somebody else's turn?
No, you please go ahead and
yeah. To apportion 15%, 14% of the defense budget for the Navy is gross injustice. And no maritime country apportions such a small percentage of the budget to the Navy. But I am taking the worst case scenario that the total budget is not going to be changed, and that the ideals that we have to reapportion the grand strategy within the constraints of that budget. In which case, I am happy to say that my recommendation is that we bring air power into the Indian Ocean. We strengthen the Air Force at Car Nicobar so that we have command of the air in the Malacca Straits, under the command of which the Navy will give a fitting reply to the PLA Navy transiting through the Malacca Straits. But there is certainly a need for air power over the rest of the Indian Ocean. For instance, if our carefully crafted strategy in the Malacca Straits does not work, we have to replicate the dominant battle space in the Gulf of Hormuz also, for which we need air power. And this is the basic case being made by the Naval Headquarters for another aircraft carrier.
So thank you for your remarks. General Saha, you heard the Admiral. He's talking about grand strategy. And he's calling for, expanding the battle space from an area where you are perhaps at a disadvantage and forced into a defensive posture. The Indian Army, of course, has done a great job and a great sacrifice, in digging its heels in and foiling the Chinese design on the line of actual control. But the Admiral appears to suggest, and we are linking all this, to the way the defense budget is apportioned and spent. He appears to suggest that with a continental strategy, we've been unable to deter the adversary, and we've at best been able to sort of ensure some kind of a stalemate, and we are playing for a status quo. but for a decisive shift in our favor. Would you agree with this? And I would like you to build this into your opening remarks, sir. Jan sir.
Thank you, Vishal, Jayant, everybody. Very nice remarks by the Admiral, and we've all studied him, over the years. So I fully, respect what he says. Let me just, before I answer the question that you raised with respect to what the Admiral has said, we must remember one thing, that China is using Pakistan as a proxy, and Pakistan is using terrorists as proxy. That's one point which we must not forget. Second, Pakistan is having enough troubles on its western border now with Afghanistan. And alongside that is the divide which is happening within Pakistan on how to deal with the Taliban of Afghanistan and the Taliban of Pakistan. And not to forget the pressures of the FATF. Later next month in February is the month of the FATF once again getting into Pakistan to assess things. It is not at all uncommon for all of us who follow this. We have seen how every time there are these internal problems in Pakistan or threats that Pakistan faces from elsewhere, how they are sort of deflected towards India. All right, even yesterday, if you see, we had a series of encounters in Kashmir, for example, and the way they are spreading, it is obviously not happening without the direction from Pakistan. So we cannot, for a moment forget Pakistan. No matter how badly off they are, their nuisance value will continue and their proxy value for China will continue. Let's come to the third point. That is, the expectations which are there, the international expectations which are there from India, because if we are growing in our stature, then we are also raising the expectations from us. And when the expectations are raised from India, obviously we have to rise to that. And with a fair amount of understanding that if you continue to, find your rightful space, you will be operating not alone, but with several others when it comes to the global commons like the Indian Ocean and all. So therefore, it makes eminent sense the way we have increased our participation in bilateral and multilateral exercises. And I'm happy that there are a whole lot of, primarily maritime-oriented exercises that India is now participating in, which is only a harbinger of the way I think we shall be dealing with this, huge global common or the battle space of the Indian Ocean that I think is very, very important. In fact, through your point which you raised, you did in fact, bring out this very important point on the rate at which the PLA Navy is increasing. It is phenomenal. I mean, we have not seen anywhere in the world this rate of expansion of the Navy. But at the same time, let's not forget that Navy is not a very easy arm where you start mastering the skills of naval maritime warfare so easily. You build ships overnight, you may build ships at a very rapid pace, but it takes a long, long time to get the skills that are required to be able to fight, in the ocean. Now, you spoke about the aircraft carrier. Nobody is questioning the fact that they are coming up with the aircraft carriers. How many decades does it take to get that mastery of aircraft carriers which is an important factor that we need to keep in mind when we look at that. And Admiral's strategy, as he himself, highlights, is about seeing what would be the future, scenarios of warfare and start preparing yourself for that.
Precisely.
He is not restricting his thought to the budget of 2022-23. He is looking much farther into the future. And here we are discussing the budget 2022-23. And if you go back to last year, we had about 3.47 lakh crores, of which 1.35 was for capital and 2.12 was for revenue, which hardly any increase over the previous year, despite what we were going through along the northern borders. Despite all the other points which I've just said, which were also as much applicable the previous year, maybe a little, changing degree with regard to what Pakistan is facing along its western front, that seems to have changed. Rest of it seems more or less quite that. And the fact, the way China has built up its capabilities in the Tibetan Plateau, and it continues to do so. The QTR was commissioned exactly, that link which comes from Lhasa across the border in Arunachal. It was delivered exactly on the date, i.e. 1st of June. The first thing that they did with that was to mobilize a combined arms brigade from Lhasa to here, and it took them just about 4 hours to mobilize and carry out the movement bit. So the point which I'm trying to say, that there is a problem, you're calling it a stalemate, call it what you will, but the point is, it is not a stalemate forever. It is only a preparation for a future. Therefore, this is the reality as we see today with the budget in front of us of the coming financial year, perhaps for the next 2 to 3 financial years, if not longer, that we have to contend with. So therefore, the budget has to find the right balance. 1, 2, we are all, as mature people who understand that there is an element of pragmatism which is required in the budget. Look at the amount of expenditures that seem to have suddenly increased because of this pandemic. Look at the reduction which has happened in terms of manufacturing, et cetera, across the economy with its imperatives. The only, the positive side seem to be, as I look at it, 2 things. 1 is the GST collection which has happened. That seems to have been at an all-time high. And the second positive factor is the export seems to be increasing. I'm not for a moment suggesting that the defense export has gone up very much. The defense export, the figures are yet to come out, will probably be in the zone of about 9,000 crores plus, which is a little more than 1,000 crores from the previous year. But the overall, exports seem to have increased for multiple reasons. Time does not allow me to go into that. So therefore, with these 2, positives, I think it would actually be a miracle if we indeed got 2%. And last time, I think it was on your show only where I had said that at the RE stage of the current financial year, we should have got an infusion of at least around 20,000 crores, which has not happened. But quite interestingly, what we are seeing in the media is the point about the Army and the Air Force not being able to spend, again for a plethora of reasons they seem to be putting out over there. But the point is, this is definitely not a good sign. And it again brings us back to one of these long-standing recommendations of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, that the defense budget, I think we really need a review on whether we want to look at it, particularly the capital budget, whether you want to look at it on an annual basis, or would you like to look at it with a little longer term? And moment you start looking at it a little longer term, I think only then can the budget start reflecting the kind of strategic thought process looking well into the future that the Admiral spoke about. So I think that should be a recommendation as far as from the forces, or for that matter, from people who think about these issues, that particularly the capital, I think, needs a much longer term outlook than this annual outlook that we are looking at. So I think I will stop here and hand it back to you.
Colonel Kuber, the general made a very interesting observation that he made a reference to reports that the army in particular has been unable to spend, or there is a significant part of its capital budget which is still lying unspent, and we have only 2 months of this financial year which are left. There are also sort of deficits or gaps in spending in the Navy and the Air Force as well, but with the Army to a great deal, almost 30% gap, which has been pointed out in these reports, which have not been verified by the government, of course, but these reports are there in the media. So while I hand over to you for your opening remarks on your analysis of the defense budget over the last couple of years, particularly over the last during the tenure of the present government, please also spare some time for this thought.
Thank you, Vishal. In fact, after those eminent opening remarks by two very eminent senior service officers, I think I can only say that I agree with them. But I thought the Admiral made a very nice remark on how to choose a place of conflict. I think that is something we need to think about, because he has changed the paradigm by this particular thought. Unfortunately, we cannot dispel the reality on the ground in the north and northeast. But considering that we can create a strategy around what the Admiral says, I think it calls for a thought, a serious thought, because that could probably even put the likes of Ziping and others to start thinking and introspect themselves whether they are in for a foolhardy maneuver. So you talked about the numbers, and I just want to say that in spite of the budget decreasing as a percentage of the GDP itself has been increasing that much. So, therefore, in real terms, the budget has been actually increasing in real quantitative terms, and in terms of the GDP, of course, it has been decreasing for a while. Maybe that's all right. So the debate is probably not on that. The debate is, what is it that the nation wants at a point in time? I think the debate is how the finance minister is likely to balance the competing requirements of a nation of the size of ours. The debate is, if social development is necessary, if medicines are necessary in the time of COVID, well, you also need an armed force to be equipped with the state-of-the-art equipment to be able to take on the threat that is imposed upon them by the international community, and the responsibility given by the nation to the armed forces to protect the territorial integrity. And here is where I don't ever want to make a comparison whether social sector is important or agriculture is important or something else is important. Well, if the nation feels that with the type of allocation that they make is adequate for the armed forces to execute the tasks given to them by the nation, well, I think we should be happy with that. So I will leave it to the wise people out there who are going to make this decision, and the finance minister who's going to create the balance to educate the wise as to how she has balanced the budget and how well it has been made for the defense. So in spite of everything, the Ministry of Defense has always got a very high proportion of the budget, and probably the highest at 14% amongst all the ministries. We have also seen that while the defense expenditure as a proportion of the central government expenditure decreased from about 16.4 to 13.7, the defense expenditure as a GDP declined from 2.4% in 11-12 to about 2.1% in 21-22. So I think the new normal is around 2.1, 2.2. This is what we are going to see. The standing committee, of course, in 2018 has recommended that it should be around 3%. Well, can we afford it? Is a question. Well, that is for the wise people to decide. But what do we have to debate today is, are the armed forces equipped? Have we carried out the modernization in the manner that we have planned? Have our long-term integrated perspective plans been successful? Have we allocated adequate funds for the services capital acquisition plans? Have we progressed on the annual acquisition plans that have been earmarked, that have been stated so much in the Ministry of Defense manuals, such as the DAP, the DPP, and things like that? Is the Apex committee convinced in the MOD, the DAC is convinced that with this budget we will be able to spend? Well, I think that is something that we need to see, because I find most of the time that we have not been able to progress certain important and inescapable capabilities of the armed forces. On one side, we are talking about Atmanirbharta, which is very good. On the other side, we should not forget that whether it is from inside or it is from outside, at any point in time, the capability of the services cannot be diluted. And that will spell a doomsday for the nation. And I think we should really think in those terms. The CIPRI, of course, says that we are the largest spenders. USA spend more than us in absolute terms, both as a percentage of the GDP and as absolute terms, whereas China spends lower in terms of percentage of the GDP than us. Also, although its absolute expenditure is about 3.7 times that we do. So therefore, again, we see when we compare with the GDP, we should also see as to where the GDP is going. So the expenditure on defense has been significantly lower than that has been projected, with a shortfall ranging from 12 to 36%. The figures are very demoralizing. If I see a comparison between the committed liabilities and the budget allocation, 2016-17, the committed liabilities 73,553 crores, budget allocation 62,619 crores. And of course, the statistics are there. 2019-20, 1,13,000 crores, and the budget allocation 89,599 crores. There's been a vice chief who has deposed in front of the standing committee to say that we don't even have enough to pay the. So where is the modernization gone? So in the modernization, on an allocation of 2.90 lakh crores, the capital budget, the modernization budget of the army is about 30,000 crores, 3637 crores, which is about 39%. The Navy from 67,553 crores to 3103, about 46%. Now, the modernization has grown on an average rate of about 11% or so. So the question that you were asking me, so if I see the overall budget from 2007-8 to from about 40,000 crores to about 14-15, which I would take as a landmark figure, about 74,125 crores, there has been an increase about, 14-15 saw a 48% increase. This particular year, in terms of the capital budget, has seen a 19% increase. If I see that 135,061 and I add another 30,000 crores which have come in terms of the emergency procurements, I would pick the modernization budget itself around 175,000 crores. And therefore, I think I would be reasonable to expect the finance minister to make an allocation close to about 185,000 crores for the modernization alone. And I really forget the question you asked. You asked a particular question while I was giving the opening. Can you just state that so that I can?
Yes. I also, Colonel Kuber, I also had this point for you that the general, of course, made a mention of the unspent monies so far.
Yes, unspent money. Yeah, I got it. Okay, I'll tell you.
So there is also, I just wanted to leave you with this thought while you're responding, that there's also been, an emphasis, and a very correct emphasis, on Atmanirbhar Bharat, on self-reliance and Make in India. Now, there is also, as part of this agenda, a great proportion of military spending has been reserved for the domestic sector. But in the short term, do you think that this could be slowing down defense spending and preventing the full utilization of the monies which are meant for modernization and capital procurements?
Thank you. I think that was the point I was wanting to make. See, amongst all the ministries, I think there are more than about 70 odd ministries in the government of India. MOD has the unique distinction of having the finance ministry sitting inside the defense ministry. We have an MOD finance, a dedicated MOD finance, and we don't spend the budget. I mean, I find it pretty ironical. Very senior colleague of mine, a very respected colleague, Mr. Amit Kaushik is there. But I mean, I'm making a very independent remark, not to, I'm surprised that we have an MOD finance and we cannot spend the budget. So I thought the MOD finance was here to make sure that we spend the budget and liaise with the finance wing in such a manner that we do it. So that is one portion. And I remember that you cannot give a dictate at the end of the year and say, spend it in the next 1 month. I mean, I don't understand this dictate either. So I do not know what you did not do in the last 8 months, 9 months. You suddenly want to do in 1 month and, be done away with that. The third is there is a procedural lapse in the whole thing. I believe the vendors' payments have to reach the CDA in some time. So there is a procedure which actually comes as a stumbling block towards spending. I think these issues, instead of having an IFA who, most of the time, I mean, I do not know whether they facilitate or they stop or they raise the right questions or they do not raise the right question. I do not know what is happening, but I know that this causes a lot of delay. The second question that you were asking about is, and I want to make this point, that one of the greatest sins that can ever happen is not spending the budget. And at a time when the country is looking forward to modernization, the country is looking forward to the armed forces meeting the challenges that they have.
But Colonel Kuber, do we need more balance? We'll come back to that a little while later.
Atmanirbhar.
Balance between our Atmanirbhar agenda and the immediate requirements and capability building of the armed forces. But let me take this first to Mr. Amit Kaushik, who is a leading voice from the Defense Finance Service. He's a leading commentator on defense spend, and he's been the financial advisor for procurements. Sir, Colonel Kuber, before you has referred to perhaps the inadequate allocation. He has said that of the allocated monies for procurements and for capability building, there's a huge proportion which is committed already. This is for committed liabilities. Now, we also know from the figures which are here in front of me that there is a gap. There is a big yawning gap between the resource projection by the armed forces and the actual allocation. And for the year, it was as high as 23% in the year 2018-19. And for 2021, it was 18%. So while I request you, I leave you with this thought while I request you to make your opening remarks, sir. Sir, we can't hear you. Could you please unmute yourself?
Thank you very much, Vishal.
Yes, you're here, sir. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by saying that, first of all, there's never ever been any question that there is a need to spend more on defense. I don't think in my years of service, anybody has ever seriously questioned this need. Conversely, it's also a fact that the gap between, as you said, the requirement projected by the services and the actual allocation, it's been increasing. 10 years back, it was about 23,000 crores. This year, it is more than 1,25,000 crores. So there is no question about it that more money has to be given, more money is required. The question, however, is what is the extent of money that is required and whether, more importantly, it is feasible to provide that kind of funds. Now, since we don't have the time, I can't really go back into the previous 5-year plans and all that. But let me illustrate the point by referring to the 15 Finance Commission report. Now, if my memory serves me right, the 15 Finance Commission report says that over the 5-year period between 2021-22 and 25-26, the gap or the shortfall between the requirement and the estimated allocation is going to be about more than 15 lakh crores, which means that every year at least 3 lakh crore more is required, right? And then also it doesn't take into account the pensions, for example, which count for about 1/3 or roughly they're about 30% of the total defense budget, which has also been increasing exponentially. So all this has to be factored into the overall allocation which is given to defense. Previous, history of allocations shows that, successive finance ministers have found it difficult to bridge this gap or, allocate the kind of money which is required to be allocated. And the question, therefore, is what is it that can be done? Can you actually say that, it should be increased and the finance minister will be able to increase the budget to the extent it is required? I don't think that is going to be possible. The problem, however, is that we have not really seriously looked at the numbers. We are more focused on convincing, one another that more money is required to be spent. As I said earlier, there is no question about it. The question is how do you generate that kind of money? How do you spare that kind of money? Or how do you take out that kind of money for defense? Which is where I don't think enough work has been done. And the discourse is focused on disjointed efforts to tackle this problem. We talk of indigenization. Now, I don't know how much can you say through indigenization to be able to bridge the kind of gap which I talked about. Or we say that we'll earmark certain budget, certain portion of the capital budget for domestic purchases. How is that going to really help this the problem? I mean, I'm not saying that it is not a desirable goal. What I'm saying is that these steps are not going to solve the problem that we are faced with. The latest, thinking is that if we create this non-lapsable pool of funds, it will go a long way in solving the problem. There again, I have my own doubts because in any case, the bulk of that money has to come from the Consolidated Fund of India. So whether you route the money through the non-lapsable pool of funds or through regular budget, it will come from the Consolidated Fund of India, to which money comes either through taxation, and there are serious limitations on raising the taxes and so on, or through borrowing, where the fiscal considerations come in. And disinvestment is another source of generation of revenue. But then there is serious limitation. This year we are, except for 1 year in the recent years, we have always fallen short of the targeted disinvestment. So where is that money going to come from? That is the main question. And I think there has to be more focus on this. The long-term planning, as I think General Saha mentioned about long-term planning, I entirely agree. But there again, we don't have an overarching organization which is a bespoke organization, which could 24/7 look into defense planning. With the result that all our previous plans have been these are totally dealing from financial realities. In 2017, a plan was presented to the United Commanders Conference, which envisaged an outlay of 26.84 lakh crores. So obviously, that plan could not have been financed except by doubling the defense budget. So that again was not going to be possible. So what is important is to focus on planning and focus on the financial viability of planning. Now, there are two other things, the short points I want to make. One was about, apportionment. See, I think we have to keep in mind one thing that, take, for example, the revenue budget of the services, about 60 to 70%. I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it is somewhere between 60 to 70% of that goes into salaries, right? Another 15 to 20% would go into other obligatory expenses like ration, clothing, and so on. So in the revenue budget, you have very little room for playing around and, increasing somebody's, share of the budget. In any case, it will come at the expense of somebody else's. In the capital, about 80 to 90%, if I remember correctly, of the amount is actually on account of committed liability, leaving very little for, apportionment or changing the shares of various services. So we need to look beyond, the conventional wisdom or conventional, way of looking at the problem, and do some number crunching. The last point I want to make is in response to my good friend Colonel Kuber's observation. See, first of all, I don't think there is any need to panic. If I remember correctly, the media reports which talk about the expenditure being only about 70%. I think these figures pertain to the month November. I mean, it's the expenditure up to the month of November. Now, which means that you still have 4 months. And if you look at the past history, it is only in the last quarter that about 1/3 of the budget is spent. So I don't think there is any grave risk that we face on account of the fact that the expenditure has been low. And it's not like buying grocery, monthly grocery, that every month the expenditure there'll be even sort of flow of expenditure. It doesn't really happen that way. And lastly, as for the MOD finance being there, the fact of the matter is that the budget holders are not the finance division. Budget holders are the services. MOD finance actually is not involved in making payments. It is the Defense Accounts Department which is involved in making payments, which is not the finance division of the Ministry of Defense. And more importantly, they will make the payment only when the expenditure is incurred, when the invoice is raised. I'm not saying there are no delays, but we have to take this into account, that there are problems on account of the procurement procedures, payment procedures, defense planning, and so on. And these are the issues which need to be addressed if we are going to tackle this problem of financial inadequacy. It's not going to happen by increasing the defense allocation. At the most, I mean, how much can you expect? Maybe another 10, 12, 13% increase. It can't be more than that, given the present circumstances. So I think I'll stop there.
And so before I hand this to Professor Behera for his opening remarks, sir, I want to come back to you very briefly, Mr. Kaushish. You've brought it out that, listen, it's not very easy to dramatically scale up defense spend. And obviously there's a huge problem in balancing the competing requirements and raising the resources. But has there ever been a concerted effort within the services and within the Ministry of Defense, the defense establishment, of making do with less? Mr. Kaushish.
Well, see, in 2008, the Defense Ministry had set up a Defense Expenditure Review Committee. And to cut a long story short, the committee, after more than a year of deliberation, came to the conclusion that there are no palpable areas where you could scale down the expenditure. The largest expenditure is on salaries. And everybody knows, it's been there in the media. How do you actually scale down the expenditure on salary and pension? And these are the largest chunks, which account for about, I think, 2/3 of the expenditure. So I don't think that while there is a desire to contain the expenditure, but I don't think it is possible to contain the expenditure to the extent that it will take care of the kind of problem that we are faced with, because the numbers, the amount that is required every year is so huge that it can't really be made good by containing the expenditure or rolling it back.
So no easy answers.
No easy answers.
So Professor Behera, who is amongst the leading commentators on defense spending, sir, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Vishal, for having me. Well, I'll start with different figures that were mentioned by different experts here. General Shah mentioned about 3,47,000 crore, and I think you mentioned about 4,78,000 crore. But the figure that I have is over 5 lakh crore. So because the defense budget, what we mean is not necessarily the one restricted to the Ministry of Defense. And some other ministries, particularly the Ministry of Home Affairs, which funds for border guarding forces. And they are directly responsible for India's defense. And they incur quite a lot of money. And when we discuss about defense budget, we should ideally include all these elements of expenditure. But that doesn't take away the point of main discussion that the budget is inadequate. Yes, it is inadequate. In fact, the US, which spends over $700 billion, they are the services, they are the Department of Defense also complains that they are not adequately funded. Now, there are a lot of constraints, but I am the one who believes that given all these constraints, India is spending reasonably good sum of money on defense, because if you add all the elements that I spoke about, so India is spending around 17% of the total central government budget. And that's not a small thing, a small portion. And for a country where 22% of people are still below poverty line. But the problem is that I think Mr. Amit Kaushik was referring to, we don't have an efficient planning mechanism which will actually get what we say the bang for the buck. Now, I will give you some startling facts. 10 years ago, our manpower cost was less than 50% of the MOD's budget. Now it is over 60%, direct salary and the pension. And if you include housing and ration, so it will easily overshoot 65 or 66%. Now, can you imagine that if you are spending 66% in a era where technology is the main criteria for winning battle? So where is our focus? And unfortunately, the planning system doesn't cater for that. So we have a system that, okay, so dil mange more, whatever we are spending, if we ask 10%, 50% more, if we get, then it is okay. If we don't get, then we'll complain about it. But we don't do anything to reform our spending pattern. I think Mr. Kaushik was referring to that review committee. There are several other committees. In fact, the Finance Commission has also suggested a number of reform measures to correct the imbalance that is there in the defense expenditure between the revenue and capital. But unfortunately, nobody is talking about that. Now, having said that, so I will talk about 3-4 more pointers about the defense budget. You are most of the panels are absolutely right that the budget has not grown, and there is a justification. And if you look at the last 5 years data, so on an average, the MOD's budget has grown by 6% on an average in the last 5 years. So, and that is inadequate given the kind of projection the defense establishment puts forth to the finance ministry, and that obviously are not met. And as a result, we have ended up in the last, I think this fiscal year, we ended up what we say shortages over 1,44,000 crore. Now, critically, I think nearly 50% of the shortages are in the modernization fund. So around 67 or 70,000 crore shortages are there in the modernization fund. That is the amount the services need to acquire or to pay for the past contract. But obviously money is in short supply, and we have to make do with whatever money is available. Now, but only the good thing about last 4 or 5 years is that I can see a bit of sign of good sign of making India making some progress. In fact, today, if you look at, if you have heard the speech, President of India's speech, the joint address to the Parliament, he said that in 2021, about 90% of the contracts that were signed, they were made in India nature. So I believe so most of them will be handed over or will be given to the Indian industry for execution. And so I hope this trend, of course, this is he cited for 1 year, and that year we didn't sign many foreign contracts. But if you look at the last 3-4 years trend, so there is an increasing trend. So the ministry is increasingly signing more and more contracts with the domestic industry. And if and there are a lot of other steps which have been taken recently, including the import ban list and several other reforms in both in the acquisition procedure and in other areas. And hopefully that will help us to indigenize more and more. And that is the only thing, positive sign I can see in the defense spending over the last 4 or 5 years. But otherwise, the budget has not grown, and there are shortages, and we have not learned how to live with the shortages. I think I'll stop at this, so maybe we can discuss.
Those are very interesting thoughts, Professor Behera. Some of the figures which you brought out are also eye-opening. Admiral Menon, he says that the professor says that the budget hasn't really grown. And for a government which has been accused by its critics of being a militarist, and most certainly, a government which has introduced hard power as an element of its statecraft, are you surprised that, the military spend hasn't grown dramatically, or they've not been able to raise the kind of resources which would elevate the profile and the capability of the armed forces to an extent which can back up their policies?
In all countries, there are three areas which must be in balance. One is defense funding. The second is foreign policy. And the third is a defense policy. Now, these three must be in a balance. In India, they are not in balance. The money is constrained, something we have to live with that. I mean, there are two speakers who said that it's not likely that we're going to get more money, in which case you have to adjust either the defense policy or the foreign policy. There are too many people, in my opinion, today who are talking loosely and casually of a two-front war. This has got to stop. There is no money for a two-front war. And if it hurt, Pakistan, Islamabad has come out with a new national security policy in which it seeks to try and become what you might call a normal state. But it has been completely ignored by those who say, yes, as General Saha said, Pakistan is going to be a nuisance. For the next 20, 30 years, it's going to be a nuisance. But it's not going to come and fly its flag over Red Fort, as Hamid Gul once said about 40 years ago. That's one issue. The second issue is that you cannot, as Professor Behera said, talk about the defense budget. You're treating the three services with a very broad brush. The Navy spends something like 65% on the capital budget. The Army spends something like 20% on the capital budget. You can't lump these two services together.
Understood, sir. Yes.
There is a problem about personnel costs, but it is not created at all by the Navy or the Air Force to some extent.
Let's take that thought to General Saha. General Saha, how does one curb these manpower costs? One, and the second question for you is the core constituency of this government, will it at some point in time force it to raise more money for defense?
Very good questions. Very good questions, both of them. Okay, I think taking a little liberty with the Admiral, these manpower problems or this imbalance is not caused by the Army. It is caused by the demands of your operational challenges. If the line of control is what it is, if it requires that kind of manning, it is a requirement. Unless the nation you are ready to say, I'm going to thin out from the line of control. Today, the line of actual control has almost become like the line of control. as a nation, are you prepared to say that I'm going to thin out from Eastern Ladakh? The answer is no. On the contrary, you are thickening up the defenses more because that is what the national requirement today is. Should the nation think differently? It's a moot point. We can go on and on discussing what is the right answer, but there is a current requirement which has to be squarely met, and it is being met. We heard about the MHA expenses on border guarding forces also being counted as defense budget. Nothing wrong with it. It's a question of changing one head to another head. But does it take away the requirement of having an X number of BSF battalions and Y number of ITBP units and Z number of Assam rifle units? You cannot change these harsh realities as they are. It does not matter which budget they are. Okay, if the manpower is that much, your salary is going to be so much. Whether you call it unsmart spending or smart spending is of no consequence whatsoever. And this notion, that there is no overarching planning mechanism, I think we are. This thought process is, stuck in the past. Let's not forget, we have a CDS. We have seen a series of defense ministers who have been highly proactive through their DACs and other mechanisms to make sure that there is some very strong prioritization happening. And look at the amount of debate that has taken place in this decision for the aircraft carrier, for example. We have seen open criticism of senior-most functionaries in public media, and have seen arguments going back and forth, and we perhaps know in which direction we are moving. So I think to say that there is no overarching planning mechanism, that is something of the past and is not at all connected with the reality. Can we reduce these expenses? I think it is almost an exercise which is happening on a daily basis. Even on that, don't you see the rumblings which are put in when some strict curbs are being put? Look at the reduction which has taken place in the travel expenses, for example, over the last almost 3-4 years now. So the point is, it is not as if efforts are not being made. It is not as if we are not, conscious of having to reduce expenses. And when I say that you must, at least I for a fact, I don't have any doubts that the money comes from the consolidated fund. But if you start allocating capital requirements in projects, I think you do a much smarter job. And with reference to your question, which you have asked two of the panelists on Atmanirbhar Bharat and their ability to deliver vis-a-vis, balancing it for the purposes of preparedness, moment you start allocating domestic projects with long-term funds, let me tell you, you will have given them that cushion of time that they require, perhaps cushion of little bit of technology that they require to be able to start delivering. So that's why I make that point.
Just one point.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes.
Back to you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just one point I want to make.
Yes, sir.
I don't want to get into the subject of the appropriation of the defense budget. I think we are on very emotional ground here, because the finest institution in the country today is undoubtedly the Indian Army. And I have any number of lifelong friends in the Indian Army. But when I saw the Republic Day parade, I could have wept.
Why so?
The antiquity of the equipment in the army, it is appalling. And that's because 82% of the budget goes for personnel and 18% on capital. So there is a problem right there. It's not so much between the services. It's in the army itself. And if the army has got to reduce its numbers, then the threats against the country have got to reduce. For that, you need a different foreign policy. There's no foreign policy expert here. But in my opinion, today, we are appeasing China and being hawkish over Pakistan. The foreign policy, the defense policy, and the funding have got to be in balance. That's my point of view.
is thinking out of the box. But to be fair to the army, at the Republic Day parade, they were displaying their traditional heritage equipment to to illustrate the
Apart from that,
the transformation which has taken place. But I'll take this to Colonel Kuber. The Admiral pointed out that the PLA actually is smaller in number terms than the Indian Army. We have General Saha, who has indicated that that the manpower deployment on these very troubled boundaries we have is essential. Otherwise, you run the risk of getting run over or at least bullied every single day. Is there, in your view, is there another way where, manpower costs could be reduced, or maybe another approach where the vulnerabilities of the adversaries could be addressed differently? Sir, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Here is where I tend to have a leaning towards the Admiral. It is a sin to have so many soldiers sitting on the LAC in such harsh conditions. I mean, it is most unacceptable for a nation to put their soldiers at risk day in and day out. In this age of technological advancement, I fail to understand why technology cannot be used to carry out that surveillance and have a force to have a credible reaction. So I think what we have done is we have not invested as much in technology. We have not given adequate impetus to the modernization. When we talk of modernization, we should come with the state-of-art technologies which can actually intervene and replace some of these people and bring them back. And that's what China does. Talking about PLA, I was just reading their cyber security strategy and the cyber warfare strategy. It is amazing to know that China is not looking at India at all. They are competing with the US. They are looking at as to how they can be the number one, because they are looking at the cyberspace. They are looking at the warfare space as an all-encompassing space. They are not looking ground separately and air separately and something separately. And therefore, if they were going to win a war, they probably are going to, whoever. And this is a Chanakya Niti. This is the Niti that we have had all through our ages, that you win a war without fighting it. And that is where I think we need to invest in technology. We need to, but that does not, I would agree with General Saad to say that you cannot straight away reduce the forces. I do not know whether I want to agree with Professor Bera when he says, when I talk of defense budget, I want to talk about everybody else. If you're increasing the Home Guard, if you're doing NCC, if you're doing NSS, if you're doing something, I think that is not counting towards a credible force that is going to be the last bastion for the nation. When you talk about the last bastion of the last call that the nation has, then I think we need to put adequate resource, adequate technology, adequate money down there. And here is where talking about that Atmanirbharta and the capability of the armed forces. One, Atmanirbharta is today escalating. I'll put it in mathematical terms. It is going as an e to the power x curve. It started from down and it's going like that. Whereas the capability of the armed forces have stood at that 8% state of art and 68%. So that obsolete thing is very high, and that is what the Admiral was pointing out, that the obsolete equipment within the armed forces is pretty high. And the second is the other curve, that your imports curve is falling at e to the power -6. So I want to know where it is going to meet. And here is where we have to decide what is the capability. Where do you want to take Atmanirbharta, and where do you want to, so therefore I think we should talk about a global village. Everyone cannot be Atmanirbhar in every field possible. I do not know if it is a very realistic expectation, maybe 100 years hence. But if we want to keep realism intact and also equip the army with the type of equipment that they need, armed forces, the type of equipment they need, I think we need to find this balance somewhere. Thank you.
We need to find the balance.
And one point over there, which I always had was, you have an LTIPP, you have a DAP, you have a DAC, you have an RFP, you have an AON. On one fine day, you decide, I'm going to stop all these programs. Either our processes are wrong, entire DAP, I think, can be closed down, because you can decide one fine day, no, from today I'm going to do everything here, and all these 20 programs have gone. That means we either don't respect our processes, or we have a newfound algorithm in which we are going to equip the armed forces with the state-of-art platforms that they have. I think somewhere we are going wrong here, and I think that needs a balance.
So Colonel Kuber is calling for a balance and a sense of realism, while at the same time, pushing the Make in India agenda. Professor Behera, the PLA in number terms is smaller than the Indian Army. In your words, you're using the words which you use. Is China getting more bang for its buck?
Absolutely. So if you look at the Chinese defense budget, so roughly 30% goes for procurement, 30% for manpower, and some 30% for maintenance and R&D. So, and that is the trend, in fact, a norm for major armed forces in the world. And I think India is the only exception here, and partly justified because we have hostile borders on both sides. And then we have to have a large standing army, and which we have. And whether we should have 14 lakh or whether we have 10 lakh, I think it is only the armed forces can decide. So I, for one, cannot say from here. But I think there is a point that we are excessively dependent on manpower, and that has cost us in terms of sacrificing some of the technological superiority that we could have achieved. And I think, and if you look at the budget, that trend is quite visible. So if we are spending 60% and clothing, ration, and including everything else, if it is 65, 67, so then obviously our focus is not on modernization, and then we always crave about that there is a huge shortage in the modernization front. There will be, because if you spend, if the government gives 30,000 crore extra, and if 20,000 goes to manpower, to serve the manpower, and obviously 10,000 will be left for modernization, that it won't be sufficient. So Chinese example can serve us better. And if you look at the trend in China also, at one point of time, they had 30 lakh. Now they are reduced all the services in China. So they are now down to less than, I think, around 20 lakh. But we have not reduced anything. In fact, our tendency is to increase. So after, I think before Kargil, there was a initiative to reduce by 50,000, but after Kargil, so we said, thank you. Now we'll go back to the old position, and then we'll increase the strength. And CDS said something about curbing the manpower cost. I think the whole community, and you can refer whom I was referring to, and came down like a ton on him, saying that no, nothing, you can tinker away with the manpower thing. And pension reforms. I think pension reform is there in the US Army, in the British Army, everywhere. But here we have not even generated enough courage to talk about pension reform. It's a taboo still. And can you imagine that we are spending 1,25,000 crore on defense pension, whereas our capital acquisition budget is around 1,10,000. And our defense pension budget is more than what what India as a whole spends on its R&D. And we want to be Atmanirbhar and innovative country. So we have a misplaced priority, and we hardly do anything to correct that. And we invent a lot of excuses saying that, okay, the nation needs this, the nation has decided this policy. Nation doesn't dream of any policy. So this we behind the nation which write policy and get the signature from the minister or the bureaucrat and make it as a national policy. And we know where the solution lies, but top solutions are always ignored, and we don't talk about that in the public domain. And that's what I have to say.
Mr. Koshish, the professor has pointed out, he's pointed towards defense pensions, which are probably more than the entire defense budget of Pakistan.
Exactly.
And of course, I remember that proposal for reduction in the army troop levels during General Malik's tenure before the Kargil conflict, of course. But I leave you with the last word. How can we do things differently with the defense budget?
Well, let me put it this way. Everything that we talked about today, and we generally talk about, whether it's about national security policy, or whether we talk about adequacy of the budget, whether we talk about pension reforms, everything is ultimately related to defense planning. And with great respect and due respect to General Sahab, I would reiterate my point that there is a problem with our defense planning. And let me put it this way: there are three things. Since we don't have the time, I can't really go into the details. But let me say just 3 points. First of all, to me, a good defense plan would be a plan which takes into account the strength and weaknesses of all the instrumentalities of the Ministry of Defense, whether it is Coast Guard, whether it is Border Road, whether it is DRDO, everything put together. The defense plans so far are only focused on the services. So you don't have a composite overarching defense plan, which is where the problem lies. And for that, as I mentioned earlier, it's a 24/7 job. What kind of pension reforms, for example, are possible? How much money should be allocated to, say, Navy or to Air Force or to Army? What should be our long-term procurement plan, etc. It's not just a function of one simple organization within the Defense Ministry. You have to take into account the capability and the requirement of all the services, all the instrumentalities. So we don't have that kind of organization, and that is extremely important, to have that organization which is overarching, which takes into account the totality of defense requirement. Number two, it is extremely important, which is something which is completely forgotten, that none of our plans so far, and I've had the privilege of dealing with some of the plans in the past when I was in service, none of these plans are financially viable. So you can't, if you have a plan which right in the beginning when you formulate it, it is not financially viable. It's the question whether you can. There is any point in having a plan like this is moot. And thirdly, we even now continue to be attracted to things which have more optical value. For example, keeping aside a part of the capital budget for indigenization. I mentioned earlier, first of all, this is not an additionality to capital budget. It's a part of the budget which in any case is allocated every year. So how is it going to solve the problem of inadequacy of funds? We don't even look at the fact that part of this money may be going out to the foreign companies, because most of the Indian companies are in any case in tie-up with the foreign companies. So it's not as if the entire money remains within the country. And lastly, this it actually links up with the first point I made about planning. You still had I suddenly remembered, a couple of years back, there was a defense planning committee which was set up.
Yes.
Now, so every couple of years, we give up an old idea and come up with a new idea, which is where the problem of defense planning is concerned. So if we have to solve everything that we talked about today, including the adequacy of budget and how to increase it, etc., etc. In fact, there has been inadequate discussion, let me tell you, on even the utility of the non-lapsable pool of funds. The standing committee reports are replete with discussions on this, all of which have been overlooked. So if we don't have a 24/7 organization which has nothing else to do except to look at defense planning, we are going to continue to talk about these problems. I'm afraid then, maybe next year we'll talk about the same things again.
Thank you all so much. We've run completely out of time, but it's been a great, wonderful discussion. And 4,78,196 crore rupees, over $65.5 billion. That was the allocation for the last financial year for 21-22. All the panelists are fairly unanimous in the opinion that there's going to be no dramatic hike, but the challenges for the Indian security are increasing, both external and internal challenges. So the big question is how to make do with less. whether it is through defense planning, as Mr. Kaushish was suggesting, or strategic reorientation, as Admiral Menon so correctly pointed out. These are decisions which will have to be pondered over. But thank you very much. Thank you, each one of you, for a very engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir. Thank you.
I'm handing this back to the anchor.